Tough act to follow.
Yeah, that is a tough act to follow. Chad's act is very tough to follow. And Chad, I think that project, where there he is right there, that's going to be the poster child product or project for Pro. I mean, that encompasses everything that Pro is trying to do and aspires to do and be. So what a wonderful example of collaboration and teamwork and win-win at the end. You all in friends, shaking hands, right? Beautiful. All right, well, I'm going to talk about similar ideas. I'll use some projects from my office. My name is Cary Kopczynski, as Phil mentioned earlier, and as you can see on the screen. And I'm based in Seattle. We operate out of Seattle up and down the West Coast and throughout the West. We also have a Chicago office. And from our Chicago office, we do work out east, southeast, so we pretty much cover the country. And I'll use a couple of project examples to illustrate the same kinds of things that Chad just finished speaking about. So, presentation outline, I want to talk first just a bit about construction productivity and why we formed Pro in the first place. I'll speak to the rudiments of Pro. Phil has already outlined a lot of that, but for those of you who don't know a lot about us and who we are and what we do and why, talk briefly about that, and then I'll use 3 different projects to illustrate success stories. So first of all, this is a story that you may have seen or may not have seen, but it appeared last August of 2024. It was produced by the McKinsey Global Institute, and the title was "Delivering on Construction Productivity is No Longer Optional." And the gist of their story was that the construction industry really needs to rethink its delivery methods. And it needs, essentially what the construction industry needs to do is shift more delivery away from what we currently do to exactly what Chad just finished illustrating. Because I think the comment that you made, you sometimes wonder, why do we do all this stuff? Why do we deliver these projects in such, boneheaded fashion, for lack of a better term? And so the gist of this story was we really need to rethink the way we're delivering on construction, and in the process we will improve efficiency and constructability and productivity. And this is one of the charts that they showed. And again, maybe I'm guessing that many of you have seen this, but for those who haven't, what you see here are some construction productivity trend lines beginning back in the year 2000 and running out to 2024. And if you look at the very bottom line there, that sort of teal colored green, that's the U.S. So what McKinsey is showing with their data is that the U.S. in terms of construction productivity is actually sliding backwards. Now, you can talk to a lot of people in this industry who would say, I don't believe this, I think it's untrue, whatever. And you can parse data in lots of different ways, right? So you can collect data and draw different conclusions from the same data set. But that being the case, what McKinsey is showing is really not very encouraging in terms of construction productivity. And what backs this up is if you look at a trend line for construction inflation in North America versus the Consumer Price Index. So the Consumer Price Index, which you can find by Googling it in this meeting, is shown tracked all the way back many, many decades. If you overlay construction inflation on the Consumer Price Index, I don't like to use the word collapse in the world of structural engineering, but we just had one there. So that's a word we ban in our office. We never use the word collapse. Anyway, unless something truly does, like that. But if you overlay construction inflation with the CPI, what you see is that it tracked pretty much with the CPI until several decades ago, and then it spiked up. It spiked up. So I think it corroborates the data that McKinsey is showing here. Here's an interesting posting from LinkedIn. This is Mr. Scott Kimpland, who I haven't met. He's with FMI Corporation. Most of you probably know FMI Corporation. They do strategic planning and data mining for the construction industry. And Scott Kimpland, I think, summed it up very nicely, especially with number 2 there. He says, trade contractors, the people who were actually going to build the project, are brought on far too late in the process. The people that know the best and most productive ways to design and build a project are the people that do it every day, the trade contractors. So the point he's making is that too often the people who are actually going to build the building are brought in so late that they have no impact on the value engineering that could have been done had they been brought in earlier. And we see this, all of us in this room, I'm sure, see this all the time. People who are actually going to build the building in a traditional design, bid, build environment get brought in too late, and they have no impact. And they see all kinds of things where there's low-hanging fruit here and there and everywhere else, but the drawings are done, the design team is out of money. That happens a lot, where you go back. We get calls sometimes on projects, can we change this or change that? And the first thing you do is you look at your budget and think, oh my God, we're out of fee. And if we can go back to the client and get more fee, maybe we can accommodate the change. And so you size up who your client is, and if you conclude that there's no way I'll get a penny out of this guy, then you probably don't make the change. You say, sorry, but we got to build it the way it is because there's no way I'll get more fee. So I think Mr. Kimplin made a really good point. Talk briefly here about ACI and PRO. Many of you probably understand this, but PRO is a separate entity from ACI, so it's a separate 501c3 entity with our own board, our own mission, vision, values, an executive director, Phil DeKemper, and yet we're joined at the hip to ACI. So it's a beautiful arrangement because we're separate and autonomous, and we can move as quickly as we want to. We can develop documents, constructability blueprints, training programs. We don't need to go through the vetting process that is mandatory for ACI. So we're separate from ACI, which allows us to move quickly, and yet we're joined at the hip, which gives us the advantage of ACI's marketing and all sorts of other administrative resources. We get assistance from people like Rex Donahue, Mike Tholen, who I see back here. And so it's a wonderful arrangement, the concept of a center of excellence that PRO is one of. The strategic initiatives, I won't read through all of these. You can see there are 6 of them, beginning with constructability at the top. And our focus thus far has been primarily on constructability because our belief is that if we can encourage designers to learn more about constructability, to think more about it while they're designing, to focus more emphasis on it, we can move the needle pretty significantly. If we could encourage the entire structural engineering community to start thinking about constructability tomorrow morning on every project they're doing, just think of how the industry would change. And if we can encourage structural engineers to make phone calls to tradespeople while they're designing and asking questions, I think we can move the needle significantly. And there are 5 other initiatives that have equal impact that we're diving into now. Okay, I want to go through 3 different project examples now, beginning with a parking structure, 2 parking structures actually, in Charleston, South Carolina. So on the left of your screen, you see a smaller garage on the right, and I'll show you some other illustrations here in a moment, but a larger garage on the right. The first one was built about 5 years ago now, 4 or 5 years ago, and it's a really interesting story on collaboration because my office got a call about 5 years ago at the request of Baker Concrete. We have some Baker people back here. Baker people had floated our name as a good resource for some assistance in improving the design of a parking structure that was pretty well complete. The design was done, but there were a lot of problems with it as identified by the contractors who were bidding it, Baker having been the successful bidder. And so the recommendation was made to go through a peer review and look for VE opportunities. So long story short, my office ended up developing a joint venture partnership with the engineer of record in Charleston. And with the input of Baker and others, we redesigned the entire garage. I won't throw out numbers because I'll get myself in trouble if I do in terms of how much money we saved and how much time we saved. But in the process of doing all of that, we saved significant money, significant time. It was a win-win all the way around. The owner was happy, the general contractor was happy, and we made a nice fee, as did the engineer of record, who got paid a second fee to redesign the project with us. Now you fast forward to about a year ago, and that engineer in Charleston called us and said, gee, that first one was so successful, why don't we team up and do the second one together right from the start? So we developed a relationship with the engineer right out of the gate to design 2 million square feet, 7,000 cars of parking that's now under construction in a very cooperative manner. So let me show you some pictures of this. So here is the airport. This goes back prior to the construction of PG3. So you see a light-colored white garage. That's what they call parking garage 2. That's the one that was built a couple of years ago. And the big field of parking on the left of that is where PG3 is now under construction. So PG3, 6 stories, about 2 million square feet, 7,000 cars. PG2, a little over half that size. Another illustration of what it looks like. This is, of course, a model, but the green one is the new one that is now under construction. Just to the right of that green garage, you see the one that we did a few years back, and it's being triggered by growth in the Charleston market, and I guess the number of incoming flights in Charleston has developed to the point that, or increased to the point that it justifies 7,000 cars of new parking. Boeing being down there, I don't think hurts them. And building, I believe this, they built the 777 there or the 787, I'm not sure. I think they built the 787, yeah, in Charleston. Anyway, here's a model. This is from our office of PG3, 6 stories. This is all long span Cunningham system, if you're familiar with long span cast in place parking. And you know, the whole key on a parking garage, and luckily I learned this a long time ago, but the key on a parking garage before you start designing structure is think about 3 things: formwork, formwork, and formwork. Formwork, formwork, formwork. Because if you really learn all you possibly can about the forming system, how it's laid out, how it moves, how you can maximize the productivity of the formwork, everything seems to work. Everything works well. So that's how we approach this in conjunction with our engineering partner in Charleston, who we teamed with. Here it is under construction. This is just a couple of weeks ago. These pictures came from Baker, I believe, or Whiting Turner, I don't recall which. But in any event, these are very, very recent. So this is the first quad going up. And you can see, let me go to another picture. Here's a good shot. So here you see one of the beam forms in the lower part of, just below where you see the plywood deck panels, you see one of the beam forms in place. And that's really the key to these Cunningham garages, is to understand how those beams are set up and move. They sit on a 5-foot wide scaffold tower. So you've got a steel beam form that sits on a 5-foot wide scaffold tower with a ledger, and then your deck panels sit on that ledger, which means the deck panels require no shoring, no reshoring. You reshore only at the beam lines. It's a very mechanized, sort of Henry Ford industrialized process. And if you train yourself when you're laying out a parking structure, or any structure for that matter, to think about mechanization, the sort of the Henry Ford mindset. How can we introduce as much standardization and as much mechanization to the process of building this building as possible? And with parking structures, certainly you can do that to a much higher degree than a lot of other building types. But here it is. This is quad 2, so the other pictures were the first quad. Here's the second quad, and up it goes, and it's so far going along very, very nicely. All right, let me jump to another project. This one is up in the Pacific Northwest, just outside of Seattle, out towards the Cascade Mountains. This is a gaming casino, a tribal casino, and the project, or the building I want to show you, is the one on the far left. It's a 15-story hotel. We got involved in this project through an architect in Las Vegas about 3 years ago now. And the thought on the hotel, the layout of the hotel seemed really, really conducive to a column-hung forming system. And if you're familiar with column-hung formwork, you understand that for the right building type, it can really, really be value added to a project. So we, in conjunction with the contractor, actually, we started laying it out to be suitable for column-hung before the contractor really began the discussion with my office. But when that discussion began, their first choice for the building was column-hung, And we'd already laid it out to facilitate column hung, so it was a beautiful marriage. And from that point on, it was just a matter of coordinating details with the contractor and dotting I's and crossing T's. But that's how it was built. So there's that 15-story hotel. Here it is going up. And here is a close-up of them actually flying one of the tables. The cool thing about column hung, if you've been exposed to it, you understand this. If not, the tables actually rely on the columns for support. So you're supporting your deck panels off of the column, which is there anyway. So you've got the column there anyway. Why not use it as shoring for your deck panel? That's the basic idea behind column hung. The challenge with column hung is that the vast majority of buildings don't allow it because of the way they're laid out. But if you understand it going into the design so that the day you start laying out the building, you understand the nuances of how that forming system works, you can lay a building out that will accommodate column hung more often than not. And this worked very well. Big success story. Here's another picture off a different project that we did a few years back. This is standing on the deck directly below the level at which rebar is being placed. This is the 31-story tower in downtown Seattle. And you can see the deck panel above, and you can see it sitting on, I think you can see that on the screen there. Maybe that's too dark. But there's a bracket on the column that's bolted through the column, and then a ledger, a stringer, and the deck panel sits on that stringer. So you can actually be doing other activities on the level immediately below the one that you're placing rebar on. Back to the project at Snoqualmie, the hotel I showed you. Here's the layout. So you can see now this is the kind of layout that you can create in hotels. It's harder to create with other building types. Hotels are about as good as it gets when it comes to laying out for column hung or any kind of fly form system because of the way your rooms modulate, 13 to 14 foot rooms, 28 foot bays. So granted, it's easier to lay out a column hung system for a hotel than many other building types, but it becomes an awful lot easier when you understand it going in and you collaborate with the contractor while you create the layout. Here's a different building, a third building. This is a few years back in Seattle. You can see again the tables on the left, and on the right you can see the tables. And the interesting thing about the picture on the right is look at the skin on the building. You're within a couple of floors of the work deck. And that's because you have no shoring and no reshoring. With a column hung system, if you lay it out right, your shoring is gone, your reshoring is gone, and so you could be doing other activities 2 levels below the structural deck. Pretty cool way to build. Let me go now to a video, if I can get this to play. Oop. It worked. It's about a 1-minute video. Okay. By the way, that was not a forest fire in the background. That was just typical Seattle weather. That's kind of a typical Seattle day. That's out east of town a few miles. All right, going on to another project, final project. This is a data center, and unfortunately I can't give you much data about where it is or who the client is because They want to keep it confidential at this point. That will change very quickly. But I want to show you something we're doing right now in the office. We're designing a lot of data centers. That seems to be the next big thing with artificial intelligence in the cloud. So here's a model of it. Great big tilt-up building. And the interesting thing about this project, we were given just 6 or 8 weeks ago, about 8 weeks ago, a bunch of information from the architect showing the panel elevations and where the joints were going to be in the panels for all the tilt-up building, and where the joints would be in the panels. Every panel literally was a different width. So the architect had laid out, and it was about 800 feet long, 400 feet wide, so quite a lot of panel. But they were all different width, and they were dimensioned in numbers like 19 foot 6 3/8 inches for the panel width. And the next one is 21 foot 2 1/2. And so we called the architect and said, why is that? He said, well, because of all the underground utilities and the power feeds and all of that, every panel has to be different. Because the building was going to have been pile supported and we were going to have pile clusters at each joint. So the idea was we had a pile cluster at each panel joint and we had to miss the piling. And we said, okay, that doesn't make sense to us. Let us think about that. So we made a few phone calls. We first called the geotechnical engineer, to see if there might be a way to go to ground improvement instead of piling. Turns out there was. So we got rid of the piling. We're going to rammed aggregate piers. So we're going to do ground improvement, which means now we can use pad footings. So now we have simply a square pad footing at each panel joint. We don't have a continuous grade beam with piling. So now it doesn't really matter where the data feed is into the building. So we went back to the architect. Well, first we actually called the contractor. And we said, in a perfect world, what would your panel width be? If you could tell us what panel width you want, what do you want? He said, I want between 25 and 30 feet. That'd be my ideal. So we picked 28 foot 6. And so we redid all the panels, and you can't see these dimensions. You can't see any of that, but I'll describe it to you. If you look at where we ended up, now we have panel widths that are about 80% of them are 28 foot 6. So now your horizontal rebar is all standardized. It's all the same. When you build your panels, you're just building the same panel over and over and over again. The other 20% of the panels are slightly different because of circumstance. But with just a few phone calls and touching base with the builder, see what panel width he preferred, touching base with the geotechnical engineer and just asking some questions instead of reading the report and assuming that it's all gospel, which it never is. With a few phone calls, we radically changed the trajectory of this project. Here's the foundation. The way it started was all piling, and you can't see this, it's too small. Here's the other half of the building. And now what you see in the middle there is a pad footing. So we're going to have a pad footing that I think ended up being 7 feet square, and it's going to be typical everywhere. So we have a simple pad footing on ground improvement. All the piling are gone. The piling, by the way, had to be socketed 5 feet into bedrock, and we had about 800 piling that were all socketed 5 feet into bedrock. So, you know, it's a massive change in course for the project for the benefit of everybody, designer, builder, owner, a lot faster. Contractor loves it. The geotech is happy. He's happy with ground improvement. But it just took some initiative to believe in the power of collaboration. To Chad's story, you know, if you create teamwork, get people out of their silos, get them working together, get them caring about other trades and other activities, you can create magic. That, I believe, is almost my last slide. There it is. Thank you very much.